Hello and welcome back to the Surfer's Library, proudly presented by Hillsborough Surf Club. I'm Billy Jack, your guide through the pages of surf history, culture, and legends. Aloha, my friends. I want to start out this episode by saying thank you to all of you that have dropped by our Instagram page to say hello. Please continue to do so and give me some feedback on what you'd like to hear in the future. This episode, we continue reading Transcendental Memories of a Surf Rebel by Michael Lear Hinson and Donna Clausen-Jost. If you'd like to read the book for yourself, it's always available on Amazon.com and EndlessDreamsPublishing.com. Also, if you'd like to help support the podcast, you can do so by visiting buymeacoffee.com/The Surfer's Library. It helps cover the cost of producing the podcast each month, so any little bit helps. When we left off last episode, Mike was chasing Jimi Hendrix all over San Diego and Hawaii, trying to get him to score the soundtrack for a demo film he was going to be making to promote his new downrail surfboard. Fate steps in and puts him in the right place at the right time, and he secures an audience with Jimmy's manager. We pick up now in chapter 39. Mike and Melinda are in Puerto Rico when they get some bad news that Melinda's sister is in big trouble in Mexico. Let's paddle out. Chapter 39. Mystic Trails. Melinda's mother was such a classic. When she was pregnant with Melinda, her daughter Bambi, a small girl with curly brown hair, brown eyes, and freckles, was almost a year old. Because she didn't want to hassle celebrating 2 birthdays each year, she insisted on a C-section on Bambi's first birthday. In the fall of 1968, David Hall took Bambi to the San Francisco Sacred Peaks on the Hopi Indian Reservation in Flagstaff for the beginning of the 30-year purification period of the planet. Although Chuck Wine was there on assignment for the Free Press, he also believed he was summoned to the Hopi Reservation telepathically for some higher reason. Chuck was a filmmaker from New York who directed Andy Warhol's My Hustler and Poor Little Rich Girl, 2 movies about Chuck's girlfriend Edie Sedgwick. He moved to LA with friend and fashion designer Charlie Backus after the CIA seized his film about the JFK assassination. By the end of the 3-day purification event, Chuck and Charlie became fast friends with Bambi and David. As the Bureau of Indian Affairs tried to break things up, everybody resisted by joining hands and oming. Then the 4 friends left the peaks for a 2-week peyote fest back in Bambi's hometown, Phoenix, where Chuck did everybody's astrological charts and Donovan Leitch played in concert on the last day. Afterwards, Chuck returned to the Free Press across the street from the CBS building in LA, and Bambi went on to Guadalajara. Before they split up, they made plans to reunite in Mexico, then head down to Peru. Bambi was a wanderer, the esoteric seeker in Melinda's family. Instead of keeping up on the latest fashions, she read Alice Bailey's books and traveled whenever she had questions about the universe and beyond. Now all she wanted to do was lay out in the sun in Guadalajara, catch up on some reading, and visit friends who were making a film in Agua Caliente, a village about 75 kilometers outside of town. When Bambi arrived at the Hotel Malibu on Avenida Vallarta, she checked into a room her friend's brother Buck suggested. Bambi would be sharing a room with a woman also involved with the film. She'd only be there for a few days before Chuck and Charlie got into town, and they all headed for South America, so it was cool. Bambi got settled. She changed into her bathing suit and went out by the pool. Typical Mexican scenery. Hot almost all year round. Tropical breezes. There was a man laying nearby on the patio. Bambi knew it might be risky, but she figured it was harmless to light up a joint. After a few hits, she started feeling really uncomfortable, like the stranger was watching her. So she put it out and laid back down to work on her tan. Buck showed up out of the blue, which was a surprise, and they headed back to her hotel room. Buck was always kind of quiet, definitely less words, more action. Part Mexican, blonde hair, average height. You could tell he was super intelligent. Bambi and Buck were just friends, though. She wasn't into horning in on someone else's husband. As soon as they got back to the room, there was a knock on the door. A Mexican man claiming to be the roommate's friend dropped off a bag. Buck brought his own stash with him, so he told Bambi not to accept it, and the stranger left. Then the federales busted in and searched the room, throwing crap everywhere. Right about that same time, Bambi's roommate walked up with her 2 kids. Bambi had never seen her before, But she thought if the police knew it was the woman's room that she and her children would be arrested, so Bambi pretended it was hers. The woman realized what was happening and split. The whole thing was absolutely ridiculous. Bambi didn't do anything wrong. She knew it would only be a matter of time before they realized what a horrible mistake they were making. When the roommate and her 2 kids came back a second time, the federales went straight for Buck's hidden stash. What was the big deal anyways? Bambi's friends were just making a movie. They weren't doing anything illegal. What she didn't know was that they were also working for a smuggling operation, and the federales were keeping close tabs on this woman. Even more shocking, Buck was involved. Bambi was certain they were disappointed to find only 30 grams instead of the large bag they tried to plant on them. The last thing she wanted was to get caught up in a drug ring. She was headed down to Peru with Chuck and Charlie. Instead, Bambi and Buck were taken to a small underground jail cell with a few cement benches. Bambi kept thinking that the federales would let her go any minute. After all, she was a senator's daughter and had done nothing wrong except smoke pot by the pool. 3 days later, Buck and Bambi were reunited, but instead of being released, they were transferred to the penal, the federal penitentiary in Jalisco. Bambi and Buck were separated immediately when they reached the penal. Bambi was led to the women's cell block and Buck to the men's on the other side of the wall. Funny thing was that they hadn't been sentenced yet. They hadn't even gone to court. They didn't have a clue how long they would be there. Chuck and Charlie hitched a ride in a VW van. The grueling drive 300 kilometers northwest of Mexico City took a few days. When they finally showed up at the Hotel Malibu, Bambi wasn't there. Melinda and I were in Puerto Rico the week of November 8, 1968. I was competing in the World Surfing Contest when we got a message through Melinda's mother from some guy named Chuck Wine. When we heard that Bambi was locked up in a Mexican jail, we hopped on the first plane over to Guadalajara. It wasn't like I needed to stick around Puerto Rico. ABC Wide World of Sports shot primo footage of the most exciting performer in the contest, Reno Abalera. Arriving in Guadalajara, I liked both Chuck Wine and Charlie Backus right off the bat. Charlie was very cool and stylish. He had a real cosmic flair. Melinda met Chuck once before back in New York at one of Marty Sill's parties, but this was the first time I'd ever heard of him. I wasn't really into the New York art house scene. Chuck had already lived 2 lifetimes in his short 28 years. There wasn't a subject in the universe this guy didn't know about. Right away, we nicknamed him the Wizard. I didn't have any idea at the time how influential he was going to be in my life. Melinda and I moved into our new digs at the Hotel Malibu to try and get Bambi and Buck out of jail. To tell you the truth, we really had no concept of how long this was actually going to take. A few days, maybe a couple of weeks. I didn't know. This was a whole new scene for all of us. Since we were camped out for the long haul, I needed to make the best of it. Thank God it happened in November. Can you imagine being stuck down in Guadalajara in the middle of summer? Talk about humid. Luckily, fall was the perfect time to be in Mexico. It was a lot like Maui. Palm trees, blue skies, rain every few days. The only thing missing were the waves, unless you wanted to walk 200 miles. But I wasn't going to complain. Bambi was the one stuck behind bars. In her free time, Bambi practiced yoga and read a lot, and it helped that she went in with a little money. Her parents also sent funds, and she gave us some of her grandmother's jewelry to sell. Like all societies, money was the key. It made life easier. If Bambi didn't want a clean bathroom, she could buy her way out. If she wanted fruits and vegetables from the open market, she had the cash. Friends and relatives could also bring food, books, and any treats we could lay our hands on, from chocolate to clothing to LSD. We'd sit out in the huge courtyard in the women's prison. Bambi would cook for us on our little camp stove, and we'd drop acid. It was so open and airy. The thought definitely crossed her mind how easy it would be to escape and split the country. But she knew that she could be released any time, and an attempted escape would screw it up for sure. We began our routine the next morning. Hit the marketplace, stop by every single organic fruit and vegetable stand that stretched out over blocks, then take the groceries on the 20-minute bus ride to the penal. At first, it was kind of an adventure bouncing around every time we hit a pothole on the unpaved road. If I'd been taller, I probably would have ended up with a few bumps on the head. It didn't take long for it to get old, though. I just kept telling myself it was all for a good cause. Melinda and I weren't married, but I was really close to her sister, and as far as I was concerned, Bambi was family. She was well worth whatever we had to put up with to get her out of jail. The first time the bus pulled up to the prison, we were all depressed, especially Melinda. The place was dirty and overcrowded. Only 32 beds fit inside Bambi's cell block, so for months she crashed in the dirt in a sleeping bag her friends bought her. One thing about Bambi is that she never complains. She could be in the worst situation, which she was, and she'd still find the positive side. She didn't tell us about the woman's warden beating the other inmates. It would only scare everybody. Instead, she described how the cats would come through the bars in the middle of the night and sit up in the window ledge, purring and looking at the caged humans. I think her attitude really helped Melinda cope with seeing her sister stuck in this filth. She couldn't do anything but be there for Bambi. On the way to and from the prison and afterwards at night, Chuck and I never stopped talking. Hours flew by as we discussed life and God. You'd never know it, but Chuck's parents were rich. His father was a lawyer and moved the family from Rhode Island to Beverly Hills when Chuck was 5. He even lived next door to Danny Thomas and down the street from Elizabeth Taylor. Unfortunately, Chuck's father was a gambler. Because of his addiction and a few other problems, the family returned back east to Pennsylvania, where Chuck went from attending a private grade school to a ghetto high school. After graduation, Chuck joined friends Joan Baez and Tim Hitchcock, Billy's twin brother, at Harvard and graduated magna cum laude in 1960 with a degree in comparative philosophy and religion. Back in the States, after returning from traveling to Hong Kong and Copenhagen, he met Edie Sedgwick in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1963 and moved with her to New York a year later as her boyfriend and promoter. He and Edie met Andy Warhol in 1965, and Chuck began taking her to the factory where they both kind of fell into the whole underground art scene, going to parties at Tennessee Williams' house and hanging out with Jim Morrison and the Doors. I filled Chuck in on my plan to make a 16mm surf demo for Bill Bain. I explained how I had originally enlisted my friend Jimmy Hovde to put some ideas together. Jimmy introduced me to student cameraman and surfer David Darling, and we headed off to Maui with Brewer for a couple of weeks to scout locations and shoot some pictures of me riding my new breakaway rail surfboard. The trip turned to crap almost from the beginning. David and I didn't click at all. He was the most negative person I've ever met. One of my ideas was to have Brewer come out of a temple in Hana. It was a pretty good concept if I do say so myself. The whole jungle scene and a mongoose peeking out of the bushes, it was exactly what I was trying to say. We shot the scene over and over, to get different angles and everything. But when we finished, David told us he forgot to load film in the camera. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only time it happened. Chuck was a good listener. He sat patiently while I rambled on. When I finished, he made it clear he wasn't impressed. "What about shooting a time capsule of the 60s with Hendrix?" he asked. The more we talked, the more I liked what he was saying. Chuck was the man to direct my movie. I offered him the job and we shook hands to seal the deal. Let's roll, big shot. It had been 5 months since we blew into town. Money was running low. Thanks to funds wired down to us from Bruce Baxter and Corky Carroll, we were able to stick around a little longer. Corky was probably still feeling a little guilty about the fast one he pulled on me a year or two earlier. There were no hard feelings, like I said. I always enjoyed Corky's big grin. But on one of his visits down in La Jolla, we caught up on surf spots, surfboards, and shaping, and I showed him a new shortboard design I had been developing. When he asked if he could borrow it, I didn't have a problem lending it out. It was no big deal. Corky was harmless. Besides, I was always looking for ways to promote my ideas. A couple of months later, I still hadn't heard from him. It even crossed my mind that I had never seen my board again. I definitely needed to give the little shit a call. Then, leafing through the new issue of Surfer magazine, I almost missed a full-page ad showing Hobie's latest, the Corky Carroll Mini model. Corky's groundbreaking design was an exact replica of the board he borrowed from me. That son of a bitch ripped me off. I couldn't believe the kid would actually screw me over. When I confronted Corky, he was speechless for the first time since I've known him. He didn't even try to defend himself. He knew he was wrong. After I lit into him and convinced Corky that I should receive compensation, together we drove up to Hobie's in Dana Point. I have the highest respect for Mike as a surfboard shaper and designer and have always given him credit for having a large influence in the development of the shortboard during the 1960s and early 70s, says Corky. Some of the best boards I've ever ridden were shaped by Mike, and I hold him in high regard as a friend and fellow surf industry survivor. However, Mike seems to think that I got the design from him. The truth is that the design for the mini model came from many different sources, as do most designs. One of the influences was from the board I borrowed from Mike when I was looking for a shorter board that would work for both me and the general public. The nose outline was exactly what I was looking for. The rails, however, were a combination of my previous flexible model and some experimental boards that I'd been working on with both Mickey Munoz and Terry Martin. The rocker was taken from the nose rider design that had very little curve in the nose but had a lot of tail kick. The tail was just a square tail that I made wider in order to have it float better while being shorter. In short, the board came from both experimentation and things that I'd gathered from boards that I'd ridden and liked. But to say the Mini was his total design is wrong. Considering Hobie's and my history, I figured I'd get a few bucks just to go away. Instead, he asked me to babysit Corky and his new young talent from the East Coast, the unpredictable Gary Proper, and design and manage their boards. I'd heard about Proper. I didn't do daycare. Fortunately, it turned out to be a pretty good gig. I was the official designer for Hobie's surfboard line, which allowed me to give the shaping industry a boost of recognition. I earned $3 royalties per board with a 6,000 board minimum, $25 per shape, and I could shape as many as I wanted. From the beginning of our stay, everyone kept telling Bambi she'd be out in a week. Most would give up, but not Bambi. She had everyone working on her case, senators and lawyers who were told by the Mexican authorities, "Just say my friends are smuggling and we'll let you go." She refused to rat them out. Playing golf at a course just outside of Guadalajara, I recalled that I wanted to go pro since 1952. My family joined the Mission Valley Country Club where I played amateur golf. I knew everything about it, from the first balls made of leather with feathers inside to the styles of Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen and their great contributions to the game. My brother Richie and I made pretty good money selling lost balls back to their owners and caddying at local tournaments for pros Gene Littler and Billy Casper. When I heard that the president of Mexico, Gustavo Ordaz, was playing at a golf tournament fundraiser, I thought, what an opportunity to get Bambi out of jail. Melinda distracted security while I wormed my way into the lineup, long hair, surf trunks, and all. Around the third hole, I pulled up next to the president sitting in his cart on the sidelines. His first reaction surprised me. What was a long-haired hippie doing on a golf course? After I threw around a few of my accomplishments in the junior league, we discussed techniques. Then, concerned, he asked, "How may I help you, Michael?" It's nice to think that begging the president of Mexico had something to do with Bambi's release, but we didn't stick around to find out. We finally ran out of money and returned to the States. A few weeks later, and exactly 9 months from the day Bambi was arrested, she was acquitted of all charges, released, and flew home with her mother. Chapter 40. 1400 to 500K. When Chuck got back from Guadalajara, and after a side trip to the moon meditation on Mount Shasta, he and I drove up to LA. We had an appointment with Michael Jeffrey about making a movie and the possibility of financial backing from Warner Brothers Studio. Sitting across from Jeffrey at a big Hollywood conference table, there was some reminiscing going on. Chuck and Michael weren't close friends or anything, but they met back in 1963-64 when Michael managed Eric Burden and the Animals. It was hard not to like Michael. He was a very charming guy. Like I said before, he had that whole Austin Powers look going for him, complete with a thick British accent. I swear, the second we sat down, Michael and Mo Austin from Warner Brothers asked Chuck to come up with a treatment. I don't know if it was a test, but Chuck called his bluff. The guy was amazing. He quickly wrote out a one-page concept and threw it back at Mo. Chuck was the perfect pitchman. He told Mo about the movie, a color vibratory sound experiment where Jimmy's notes would be converted into colors. Tai Chi and Kundalini yoga experts would take part as well as color healers. By doing this concert, Chuck said, we can change the vibratory rate of the planet, slow it down. The two men were all ears, but you could tell they were confused. Jimmy will turn every note into a color, he kept going, which will have an effect on our astrological signs. When Chuck finished, the room went silent for way too long. Then Mo spoke. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, Chuck, but I'll give you the money anyway. The studio exec was convinced that Chuck was a genius. It definitely helped that Jimmy was looking for something to channel his high energy into. We all knew the studio wouldn't have looked twice at us if Hendrix wasn't involved. Michael Jeffrey gave the studio Jimmy's full commitment to score the movie as well as record an album, and in that one meeting, our budget skyrocketed. I started with $1,400 from Bain. It jumped to $40,000 when Michael Jeffrey came on board, and we now had $500,000 promised to us by Warner Brothers. Chapter 41. In the Spotlight. The tide was also turning for the Brotherhood. All of a sudden, there were some heavy hitters in the mix, which meant pressure from all sides. If you ask me, it was pretty intense for a while now, and it was only going to get worse. Things get edgy when a lot of money is involved. It didn't help that Leary brought the spotlight with him when he moved out west. That guy loved being the center of attention. The more media, the better. While Leary was extremely flattered by Johnny and he respected Johnny's wishes, he never really felt his relationship with the press had a negative effect on the Brotherhood. Basically, Leary did whatever he wanted. He knew he was a cop magnet and never once tried to tone it down. I know for a fact that the police didn't know what to expect when Leary showed up. They definitely didn't know how to handle him, that's for sure. So they kept their distance for a long time and just observed. When Ronald Stark pulled up at the ranch, he wasn't what the brothers expected at all. He was this greasy-looking guy with a long, thick brown mustache and a gut that almost popped the buttons on his wrinkled shirt. Personally invited by one of Leary's connections, Stark was looking for a buyer for a huge load of acid. Rattling off a list of accomplishments, the troll bragged about everything from the languages he spoke to his apartments in Greenwich Village and Paris, while name-dropping the Kennedys, the Japanese Mafia, and the Dalai Lama practically all in one sentence. No way were they falling for this guy. It wasn't until Stark mentioned he was the leading supplier of a new, more efficient LSD production method, freezing it overnight produced nearly pure samples, that the boys started paying attention. The topper came when he pulled out a kilo of pure acid and knocked their socks off. The boys were mesmerized and convinced he was their man. Johnny offered him the position of banker and gave him full rights as their distributor. As overseer of the entire operation, Stark dedicated himself to making the consumption of acid an international black market commodity. He did everything but guarantee that the Brotherhood would become the largest distributor of LSD in the world. Territories spread out, and within a year they had dealings on 5 continents. The Brotherhood's operation was growing faster than they had ever imagined. Chapter 42. Busted. Purcell and Babcock turned down Woodland. It was pitch dark that night, and there was a suspicious-looking station wagon parked on the street with smoke coming out of the open wind wing. Neil Purcell was a rookie with the Laguna Beach PD, and everybody in town knew he was after Leary. He and his partner cruised Woodland and Thurston Trailer Park regularly. They wanted the bus so bad they even hid up in the trees like a couple of monkeys. I swear, at any given time you could look up and find them up there perched on a branch. Purcell got out of his cruiser and tapped on the window with his flashlight. He asked the driver to roll it down. The wisp that slipped through the crack quickly grew into a thick cloud of marijuana smoke, and Purcell demanded to see a driver's license. Leary and his wife Rosemary had dropped his daughter Susan off at their apartment in Laguna the day after Christmas. Planning on spending some time up at their home in Berkeley, they swung by Johnny's, where he still kept a place in the canyon, to pick up his son Jack. Officer Purcell returned to his radio and whispered a frantic call to the dispatcher. Within minutes, backup arrived. Purcell then ordered the Learys out of the station wagon while he ransacked the vehicle looking for evidence. Leary just laughed as he and his family were handcuffed and dragged off to police headquarters for 2 measly roaches. All 3 were charged with possession of marijuana and released on bail by the Brotherhood's lawyer within the hour. Chapter 43. Everyone's Loss. In the summer of 1969, Johnny Griggs was curious about synthetic psilocybin, which was an early attempt at synthesizing the active ingredient in mushrooms. It didn't scare him that they were man-made. Johnny was fearless when it came to experimenting with the unknown. He knew there was a risk in using psilocybin in this unfinished state, but he and some of the brothers wanted to test it out. Johnny almost always took psychedelics as a part of a religious ritual. Even at the closing of all smuggling deals, everybody dropped LSD together. It was tradition. Unfortunately, on August 4th, the tide turned for Johnny. His experimentation with the untested psilocybin went awry. After ingesting the artificially made chemical, and once his body reached the point of rejection, it was way too late to reverse this sudden change of fate. At the time of Johnny's death, the Brotherhood had such a stellar reputation internationally that you could go to any marijuana or hashish producing village in the world, mention their name, and be treated like royalty. But because all the profits were put back into turning the world onto LSD, they didn't personally gain from the venture. Where the Brotherhood did succeed was helping make LSD more affordable to the masses. When it was first available, it was hard to get and very expensive. By 1969, LSD was a fraction of the cost, so money was never the prize for Johnny and Carol. Instead, they preferred to cherish the simple things in life: family, friends, God. It was their hearts that were rich beyond belief. When I heard through the grapevine that Johnny died, I went into shock. My knees went weak and I felt sick to my stomach. One of the things that impressed me most about my friend turned out to be his downfall. He was never afraid to look life straight in the eye. It was just like the story I heard about him before we met. Sitting around the table with an unknown drug, everyone afraid to try it except Johnny. He swallowed it, not sure what kind of reaction he'd have, and blew everyone away. Larry was back east on the lecture circuit when he received a call with the devastating news. He said that John Griggs was one of the most successful, radiant holy men he had ever known. Chapter 44. A Joining of Hands. After August 4th, 1969, the Brotherhood, as I knew it, fell apart. Not only was it hot weather-wise, the summer of '69 was a pressure cooker in Laguna Beach. I'm sure Purcell was stoked. Leary was in jail and Johnny Griggs was history, which brought even more attention to the Brotherhood. One thing I never understood was how the guys could stand being in a constant spotlight. When the Brotherhood was formed, I figured I'd be involved for a year at the most. I remember asking a friend how long it had been going on. He told me 5 or 6. Neither of us were really sure if it had been a flashback or the real thing. Jesus, you mean we've been getting away with this kind of shit all this time? Well, I'm not condoning it. Drug smuggling in the '60s was liberating all on its own. But Johnny's dream was much deeper. Dropping acid meant taking a really good look at the world, having a relationship with God, and being kind to others. Looking back, it was also an educational experience. As soon as large amounts of cash came in from a drug deal, it was paid out for another. $10 was no different than 1,000. The real lesson was not how much money you end up with, but how you accept the crap that goes along with it. There was a change in the weather all over the country in 1969. I think the events of the '60s pushed the country to the limit, and by the end of the decade, everything just started crumbling. It seemed Love Child concerts were dying out when the Rolling Stones played Oakland in November and hired the Hells Angels to provide security. When a bunch of people started yelling, a woman pulled a gun and was stabbed to death by one of the Angels. Charlie Manson and his dysfunctional family also went crazy that year when they went on a killing rampage in LA. And in December, the surf in the Pacific Hemisphere was the biggest I've ever seen. Hawaii was grinding up to 50 feet. When a 20-foot swell started in Mexico and California, it was accompanied by 30-mile-an-hour onshore gale winds. Things would never be the same after Johnny died. The '60s and the true meaning of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love were behind us now. Johnny had always been the driving force behind the brothers. Hell, he was the Brotherhood. Chapter 45. JG. Life works in strange ways. When you lose someone close to you, there's always somebody waiting in the wings. I don't know if God was trying to replace Johnny Griggs. I'll tell you right now, that would be impossible. He made such an impact on my life. All I can say is that someone upstairs was pulling strings because right after Johnny Griggs died, I met John Gale. What a coincidence that besides my son, the 2 most influential men in my life shared the same name and initials. John Gale was actually living on Woodland when I met him, only a block away from the Griggs' old house. I had no idea that he'd been working with the Brotherhood. Like I said, I didn't spend a lot of time in Laguna. One day, Mike Haley said he knew a guy who looked a lot like me. Got my curiosity up, that's for sure. The first time we met was hysterical. All we did was to try out brag each other the entire time. Man, was he edgy. He was the son of a successful entrepreneur who owned a slew of businesses, including Chris Craft Boats. I have to admit, Johnny, or JG as I called him, got the upper hand most of the time. But he was also very charming. You either liked him or you didn't. There was no in between. The ladies had no choice. They went nuts over JG. He couldn't go clubbing without a line of women trailing behind. Haley was right, though. The similarities between us were scary. Except for the fact that his hair was a little darker and down to his waist, JG was an accomplished surfer. He was maybe 5'6", and we were both serious pack rats. We also had the same temperament. This guy just took it to another level. I'm way more laid back, if you can believe that. He had it all, though. He smoked everything, collected souvenirs from around the world, and slept with women of all ages. We got along so well at the first meeting that we even talked about starting a surfboard business. John Gale sold Orange Sunshine like crazy for the Brotherhood and stockpiled a load of cash, says John Hawthorne. The money was just sitting there collecting dust, so he's trying to figure out what he could invest in, and at the same time, prove it is legitimate income for the IRS. I suggested he start a surfboard manufacturing business. Coincidentally, at the same time, JG met Mike Hinson. I was blown away when I left JG's house. This guy was too much. First, I needed to make sure he wasn't total bullshit. I couldn't get wrapped up in his enthusiasm. 3 days later, I came around again to see if he would back up his action. He didn't disappoint me. What blew me away more than anything, though, was when I found out that Johnny Griggs died on JG's birthday. Our friendship was on. My smuggling days for the Brotherhood fizzled out a long time before Johnny Griggs' death. I was spending most of my time surfing and working on the movie. Sure, I still dabbled in the business, but the whole mood of the Brotherhood had changed, and I wasn't sure if I really wanted to be involved anymore. The straw that broke the camel's back that sent me running for the hills was when Mystic Arts was mysteriously torched on June 6, 1970. Fire officials said they received 3 calls reporting the fire at 1:15 midnight, but by the time they arrived on the scene, Mystic Arts was completely engulfed in flames. By morning, nothing survived the fire but the mandala. Unbelievable. The big question is how it got out, says Dion. The mandala was painted on 2 4x8 plywood panels that were joined along the diagonal. Some guy carried it out, but that thing was heavy. How did he get it out of a burning building? Nothing else survived the fire, and the mandala was the farthest from the door. Was it moved before the fire? It was scorched, so probably not. It was a mystery within a mystery. What I heard happened was under orders from city higher-ups, someone hopped on the roof late on the evening of June 5th and dropped gas bombs down the vents, clean and easy. The brothers couldn't do anything but just stand by helplessly and watch their hard work go up in smoke. Several of the city council members excused themselves from the council meeting to witness the fire. When they returned an hour later, they announced, "It's finished." The police department's lie of the whole conspiracy trip turned them into a sick bunch of bastards. They even tried to blame the Brotherhood, accusing them of having financial problems. No matter. What it all boiled down to was that after 3 frustrating years, the cops tried everything in the book to shut it down and resorted to arson to get revenge. First Johnny Griggs, then Mystic Arts, the Brotherhood was imploding. Some of the brothers moved to Hawaii, some headed for Oregon. I also went underground with my 3 passports. When I think about it, 6 years was just enough time for the Brotherhood to accomplish what they set out to do. I was lucky enough to have lived through the birth and death of a well-intentioned revolution. I'm sure glad I was there. Chapter 46. Expression Session. That same year in 1970, Haley and I had an idea to stage a surfing event with no rules or judges, just the best surfers in the world going out and expressing themselves. We called it the Expression Session. Instead of being judged on personality, the number of waves, or ridiculous antics, the contestant had the freedom to go out any time during a predetermined time frame and express himself completely. This would get rid of the competitive ego trips, kind of a relief for the soul surfer. We approached Duke Boyd and Dick Graham at Hang 10, and they liked our idea so much they sponsored the first expression session. 25 world-class surfers were voted in to ride Pipeline for a day. When I showed up, I wasn't really ready to test drive my high doll fin in 10 to 15-foot surf in front of a bunch of surfers, magazines, and movie people. The rules were to be at the beach early and surf as long as possible during the 4 to 5 hour event. But when I arrived, it was way too big for a test ride. I had only surfed in small beach breaks a couple of days before coming over. For all I knew, I could have taken off and whirly-wheeled down the face of the wave. I waited a couple of hours, hoping the surf would get smaller. Instead, it got bigger with each set. After a while, everyone had surfed at least once and were ready to go again when I hadn't even caught a wave on any of the 3 boards in my quiver. Since the expression session was partly my idea, I knew everybody thought I needed to get my fucking ass out there. So I waxed up my 10-6 gun and headed for the surf. 2 waves peaked on the outside reef and measured about 25 feet, one of the biggest sets of the day. Sam Hawk caught the first wave. I scrambled for the second on the outside reef. It pitched up just enough to catch and then backed off to form into a wall of water that closed out across the beach. All I could do was ride straight down the face, bottom turn left, drive my board back up to the top and kick the board through the lip. Up into the offshore wind, my board was blown to safety over the back of the wave. I dove feet first into the face and caught the surge of water that pushes you back out the top. That's the only way to get away from the churning water that sucks you in. I paddled out past the whitewater rushing on shore, turned around, and when I saw how bad the next set was, I rode in and split. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us again next week as we continue reading from Mike Hinson, Transcendental Memories of a Surf Rebel. Until then, keep your toes on the nose, your bottom turns tight, and your stoke high. I'll see you in the lineup.